I've never done a video before, but I'm gonna try. Hi. So the last few chapters of Gun Island were a roller coaster, to say the least. Obviously, most of the book has been kind of a roller coaster. But I guess I'll just go over the summary real quick. So Cinda's showing him around and kind of taking him, Dean, through the steps of essentially what the gun merchant would have experienced in his time there. And they go to an art exhibition, and there's what is supposed to be the replica of a monster. And so then Cinta's like, let me show you. And she talks about how her uncle once saw it, and there's just kind of like this cute, kind of scary story that's passed down through generations. And so they get to the place where it's supposed to be, and of course she knows that it's probably not going to show up, but she does want to show him the like beetle worm things. Shipworms. They're shipworms. Okay. So she shows him those, and in the process, of course, some of the wood breaks, and it's a big mess, and Cinta gets hurt pretty badly, and Dean knows he's not going to be able to carry her out because there's high water, which is the title of the chapter. And luckily, there's somebody in the abandoned building nearby, which happens to be someone they know. It was Bilal, B-I-L-A-L. I don't know how to pronounce his name. And so, of course, just as I suspected, this book is filled with a bazillion coincidences. So, of course, it is somebody that they know that ends up being, the one to call the ambulance to save them. And when they get to the hospital, he runs into Raffi there and talks to him and just says, hey, I need you to tell me the truth. What happened with Tipu? Did you guys both come here together? And Raffi explains all of it, which takes like 4 pages of this horrible, crazy time that they go through together, which is super heartbreaking because I know that these stories are very similar to what happens in real life. And he makes it, but of course Tipu does not, and ends up called away to Egypt, where he's supposed to meet some Ethiopian woman, which I think is super interesting because by the end of the book we still don't know anything about this Ethiopian woman, which almost leads me to believe that it's hinting at the snake goddess. I forget her name. There are also parallels to the goddess with Cinta, which I think is interesting, and I'll get to that in a minute. But that's what happens next, and then he ends up going home, and because he finds out that Tipu is actually on the blue boat, he calls Jiza. Oh, sorry, my cat. Oh! My cat knocked it over. So he calls Jiza, and they set up a whole group of people that are going to come on the blue boat, including the documentary crew, reporters. She luckily sets everything up as far as like bedding and food and all of provisions that they're going to need. And then later, obviously later, the next day, there's like a bunch of crazy weather things happening, and Dean goes to the hospital to visit Cinta, and when he gets there, Raffi is in, oh my gosh, my cat is being crazy. Raffi is in Cinta's hospital room, and Cinta has already arranged for both her and Raffi to go on the blue boat, which of course Dean doesn't agree with, but he can't say no to Cinta because she has a lot of power and sway, socially and money, economically. So he just kind of has to go with it. On their way to get to the boat, there's a tornado which scares Pia, and she hides in Dean's chest which is really surprising because her character doesn't seem to be like the kind of person to do that. So of course Dean is like, oh my gosh, whoa. Because there's this big tornado, it fells a large tree that ends up in the road, and they can't pass it. But the Banduki Sadagar, which at least that's who Raffi thinks this man is, who is robed, comes up to the window and says, hey, there's another road, there's another way that you can get to where you're going. Which is interesting because he doesn't really know where they're going. Apparently he knows the direction they're going, and that's about it, but he leads them where they need to go. Which, of course, is, again, a coincidence, right? That there are all these signs and all of these people that seem to be helping them along the way. So they end up getting to the boat, and the Lusania, and while they're on the boat, Pia is looking for her dolphins, the specific type of dolphin that starts with C. Don't know how to pronounce that either. But she ends up seeing like multiple species, and this continues to just kind of compound on itself until by the time the conservative ships are spotted, and by the time the blue ship arrives, there are all of these species of different animals, and they're, according to Pia, they're migrating, and that's the reason why there are all these strange behaviors. But obviously it's another coincidence that these things are happening pretty in line with the story of the gun merchant. And again, that's a trend that's like going through the entire book, is that there are these parallels between the characters, oh my goodness, the characters in the story and the gun merchant. Hi. Say hello to the camera. There are all of these parallels, and I actually wanted to point out a few. So, the last chapters we read, I wrote that I actually think there are a lot of parallels between Cinta's character and the goddess herself. And one of those showed up in the chapters that we read this time as well. And so I actually highlighted it, and I was going to read it. Oh, on page 253, it says, "It had been so long since I prayed that I did not know who to pray to. When I knelt beside her and shut my eyes, the image that appeared before me was that of an open palm sheltered by a cobra's hood. Look, it was Cinta, tugging at my elbow." And so I think this is really interesting because the snake goddess, if we assume that she controls snakes and that she is sort of speaking through the cobra who has been giving Tipu these like visions, then I think it follows that there's this kind of hint that when he sees the cobra and it's actually Cinta, then maybe there's a connection there. And then other parallels to the story that I noticed in these last chapters were, of course, when Raffi believes that the Banduki Sadagar, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, is the one who leads them to the other path that they need to go on. That's obviously another reference to the story. And then on page 281, when I guess I marked this part, and it's not really a parallel directly to the gun merchant story, but it is one of those things that's kind of like hinting at believing that supernatural, as Cinta, I guess as Dean would call it, and Cinta would argue, is not the best way to describe it unless he believes in both the natural and the supernatural, and that the natural can't exist without the supernatural. Anyway, another coincidence, I guess, is on 281, when it says, Jesus was just telling me about something that happened today, and Cinta said, when she was trying to call Ima in Rome. At some point during the 20 anxiety-ridden minutes when Jesus was unable to get through to her partner, she had heard a voice, a girl's voice, saying, Sta tranquilla, Ella. Don't be upset. They're all right. Your children. Nothing has happened to them. And so obviously this is another point where it's like, where something that should not reasonably happen, right? Ghosts don't exist. My cat insists on knocking this over. I apologize. Anyway, so it's kind of wild that Cinta's daughter is somehow speaking from the grave, and then again when Cinta says that she's with her. But I don't know if I mentioned this, but obviously everybody on the blue boat made it safely, and the captain of the ship that was sent by the state, or by Italy, made the decision to rescue them because there was a natural miracle that occurred, and he used that as kind of like a loophole in his orders, in which he was told not to let them come to land. And I don't think he's ever seen this set up before, so he's just kind of freaking out. So that's the happy part of the ending. And then the sad part, of course, is when Cinta dies, but she's at peace, so it's kind of good. But I definitely cried a lot right before I chose to make this video about the reading, because Cinta was like probably one of my favorite characters, just because she was really open-minded and she taught Dean so much, and she's the reason that so much of this happened in the first place. And she just seemed like such a beautiful lady. And of course, my favorite word, I think my favorite concept that comes out of this book is the Bhutas, the Bhutas, which means living being, past and present, and also kind of hints at the idea of ghosts. And I love that concept that everything that's happening in the past is currently happening, and what's currently happening could have also happened in the past. And this idea that, you know, the story of the Gun Merchant is being mirrored in the story that we're reading of Gun Island. And I think that that's just a really beautiful concept and something that's explored in different ways in a lot of literature. But I think it's just absolutely, it's just so cool because, you know, there's this saying that history repeats itself, and in this word, the etymology of this word implies that history is intrinsically still happening now, and that's just like the way that it is. So I really love that, and it shows up again, of course, on 307 when it says, Cinta gazing upwards, using the Italian word for a flock of birds in flight, and it seemed to me that this was indeed the right word, the only word for the phenomenon that we were witnessing. A storm of living beings, Bhutas. Now returning his glasses on the blue boat, Raffi cried, Look over there. His finger was pointing to the prow of the fishing boat, where a robed figure could be seen standing erect between the bows. It's a woman, cried Pia. She must be the Ethiopian, said Raffi, the one who called Tipu to Egypt. And then, like, here, like I said, we just don't get any information about who this Ethiopian woman is, which almost, again, leads me to believe that maybe she is the snake goddess, for real, or the present equivalent of who the snake goddess is, even though there are a lot of parallels to Cinta as well. And so I think my question for the end of this book is, who is the Ethiopian woman? And what is this book saying about nature and human relationship to nature? and what is it saying about stories or legends and what part they play in our lives. I think what really gets me to that specific issue is when Cinta is talking about how stories are what separate us from the animal kingdom, but what if stories are actually a remnant from the animal kingdom? Because that's when, the universe can speak. That's when animals can speak, or they're always in legends and stories and mythology. And what if we tell stories as a way of kind of hearkening back to the animal kingdom that we came from? And I also just kind of wanted to reflect on how I feel about this book. I think it's actually one of my favorite books I've ever read. I think that it gets at a lot of really important issues as far as why we tell stories and our relationship with nature as a human species, and especially I think not being too uppity and thinking we know everything, because I think that what tends to happen, especially in intellectual communities, is that there's this belief that science is the only way. And while I agree with that to an extent, I think that there's a point where it can become a barrier to understanding more things. I think that, if you hold on too tightly to any one belief or any one form of understanding the world, that you tend to close yourself off to things that you should be open to. And so, for example, in this book, Dean is just like, no, science and reason only, and Pia is like, science and reason only, but we don't really understand these creatures all that well, so I'm sure there's a scientific explanation for it, and there probably is. However, I think that it is important to realize that, throughout this entire book, there are all of these coincidences, and there are all of these things and signs that lead these characters to where they end up at the end, and I think that that's saying something about listening to the universe around us and just kind of paying attention and not closing ourselves off because of one specific belief or dogma. And I think it's really interesting, too, that earlier in the book, Dean talks about, I need to have faith, I need to have faith. And when he's saying that, he's referring to having faith in reason and having faith in his view of reality. And at that point in the book, he's very closed off to what's happening, until Cinta, referring to the spider and referring to the gun merchant story, is telling him, I think this is your awakening, and you're breaking out of that and into some deeper understanding that's really important. And that's when he really starts to open up and isn't so insistent on having faith in reason and his view of the world as it was, and he starts to open up to the possibility that these coincidences aren't just coincidences, and that it is very possible that there are signs and that there are things that are important in the story that he was researching that are now kind of coming to fruition in symbolic ways in his own life and in the lives of people around him. I also had another question, and that's just kind of about immigration and migration. I think it's really interesting that animal species are migrating throughout this novel, and those migration patterns are being disrupted by human behavior. And then we get a lot of humans who are migrating, and at the end we get the explanation from Dean, which is basically that, white colonizers were in power for so long, and they were forcing migration of so many different populations of people for their own gain, essentially enslaving these people and forcing them to travel to these different places so that they had financial gain. And in the present day, there are a lot of people who are taking it into their own hands in order to travel. And they are also traveling in different ways because of the environmental changes and shifts that come from climate change and come from the way that humans are interacting with nature and the environment. And so I think it's interesting that the book also parallels the migration of animals to the migration of people, and the struggles that people are going through, as well as these animals dying off and beaching themselves, I think also parallels with some of the atrocities that these poor people are facing as they are trying to make their way to other countries. And so I think that's also interesting, and I don't think I have a very clear question for that, other than what statement is being made about it, I guess. And yeah, so I think that is essentially it. Also, the art behind me was done by an artist in Rome, which seems appropriate, sort of, considering I just finished reading this book where towards the end it was set in Italy. And so, yeah, seemed like an appropriate backdrop. Her name is Agnes Cecile, or her legal name is Silvia Pellicero, if anybody's interested. Anyway, this book was amazing, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to write my research paper about yet. I'm assuming it's probably going to be something to do with environmental activism, or maybe with immigration activism. But I'm not entirely sure, maybe even on how other books around the world treat stories, because I have read a few books that talk about the importance of stories and how they play a role in the lives of humans, and how stories are alive and important. And so yeah, I don't know. But that concludes my video. So thanks, and sorry the camera fell so many times. It is his fault. Say hi, Onyx.